The hallway stretched out endlessly, a long corridor of concrete and painted metal that felt more like a tunnel into the past than a simple storage facility. The air here was different from the outside world. It was recycled and dry, carrying a distinct smell of dust, old cardboard, and the faint chemical scent of cleaning solvents that had been mopped over the floors years ago. Overhead, long tubes of fluorescent lights hummed with a low, steady vibration. The light they cast was harsh and unforgiving, showing every scuff mark on the floor and every scratch on the gray walls. Keanu walked slowly down the center of the aisle. His hands were buried deep in the pockets of a dark, worn hoodie. He didn't look like a movie star in this moment. There were no cameras, no fans calling his name, and no busy crew members adjusting lights or microphones. Here he was just a man in his 50s, moving with a quiet, heavy grace. His boots made a soft, rhythmic thudding sound against the concrete floor, the only noise in a building that seemed to hold its breath. He hadn't visited this place in a very long time. He couldn't remember the exact date he had last stood in this hallway, but he knew it had been years, maybe nearly 2 decades. Back then, his life was a blur of constant movement. He was always traveling, always filming, always running from one city to the next. He had rented Unit 402 on a whim during a chaotic transition period in his life, shoving boxes of his personal history inside and slamming the metal door shut, promising himself he would deal with it later. But later had taken a long time to arrive. Life had a way of sweeping you up, carrying you through joys and tragedies, making you forget about the concrete boxes full of junk sitting in a quiet building on the edge of town. As he walked, he glanced at the numbers painted on the side of each unit. 388, 390, 392. They were all closed up tight, hiding the secrets of other people's lives. He wondered what was inside them. Maybe furniture from a divorced couple who couldn't bear to look at it anymore? Maybe old clothes that no longer fit? Maybe, like his, they held memories that were too painful to keep in the house, but too precious to throw away. It was strange to think that this long, sterile hallway was a graveyard for objects, a place where things went to wait. He finally stopped in front of Unit 402. It looked exactly the same as the rest, a gray metal roll-up door with a small handle and a heavy lock. But to him, it felt heavy. It felt like it was radiating a specific kind of energy, a pull from the past. He stood still for a moment, just looking at the scuffed paint on the lower part of the door. He felt a tightness in his chest, a mixture of dread and curiosity. Opening this locker wasn't just about seeing old things. It was about confronting a version of himself that no longer existed. Keanu took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the dry, cool air. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, stalling. He was a man who usually faced things head-on, whether it was a difficult stunt on a movie set or the harsh realities of grief. But this was different. This was quiet and personal. It was the clutter of his own history, boxed up and left to gather dust in the dark. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring of keys. The metal was cold against his fingers. There were only 2 keys on the ring. One was for his home, a place of peace and simplicity. The other was for this locker, a key to a chaotic time he had left behind. He looked at the key, turning it over in his hand. It was an old-fashioned brass key, slightly tarnished now. He thought about what might be waiting for him on the other side of that metal door. He knew there were books, piles of them. He had always been a reader, and back then he bought books faster than he could read them. There were probably scripts for movies he had made and some for movies he had turned down. There were clothes, jackets that had gone out of style years ago, and perhaps furniture he had picked up in a moment of impulsiveness. But it wasn't the objects themselves that made him hesitate. It was what the objects represented. They represented a time when he was younger, perhaps a bit more reckless, a time before he had learned the hard lessons that life had taught him since. He had lost people he loved since he last locked this door. He had experienced heartbreak that reshaped his heart. The man who filled these boxes was a ghost now, a shadow of the person standing in the hallway today. The hum of the lights seemed to get louder as he stood there. He looked down the long, empty corridor behind him. No one was coming. It was just him and the silence. He realized that he was the only one who could unlock this part of his life. He couldn't hire an assistant to do it. He couldn't send a friend. It was something he had to do himself. It was a way of honoring his past, of acknowledging that everything he had been through led him to where he was standing right now. He stepped closer to the door. He could see a small layer of grime on the handle, proof of how much time had passed. He didn't wipe it away. He just gripped it, feeling the cold metal seep into his palm. He needed to do this. He needed to open the door, look inside, and perhaps finally let go of the weight he had been carrying around for 20 years. Keanu closed his eyes for a second, centering himself. He thought about the sunlight outside, how warm it was, and how good it would feel to leave this place once he was done. He thought about the simplicity of just driving home with an empty trunk, knowing that he had faced this.
With a slow, deliberate movement, he took the key and slid it into the lock. It didn't go in smoothly at first. The mechanism was stiff from disuse. He jiggled it gently, feeling the tumblers inside the lock grind against the key. It was a resistant sound, like the lock was arguing with him, trying to keep the door sealed. But he persisted. He applied a little more pressure, turning his wrist. There was a sharp click that echoed in the quiet hallway. The lock gave way. The shackle popped loose, and Keanu pulled the heavy brass padlock free from the hasp. He held it in his hand for a moment, the weight of it surprising him. Then he dropped the lock into his pocket. He reached up and grasped the handle of the rolling door. His fingers curled around the cold metal. He took one last breath, bracing himself for the rush of memories that was about to come. He didn't know what he would see first. He didn't know if it would smell musty or stale. He only knew that there was no turning back now. With a smooth, strong motion, Keanu pulled the handle down and began to hoist the heavy metal door upward. The sound of the metal rollers rattling on the track broke the silence, a loud, clattering noise that seemed to pierce through the years. As the door rose, the dark void of the storage unit began to reveal itself, shadows retreating as the harsh fluorescent light spilled into the space. He lifted the door all the way to the top, securing it in place, and then he simply stood there, staring into the darkness, completely silent. The metal door rolled all the way to the top, locking into place with a sharp, final snap. The sound echoed for a moment and then died out, leaving the unit in a heavy, expectant silence. Keanu stood in the open doorway, not moving yet, just letting his eyes adjust to the shadows inside. The light from the hallway cut a bright square across the concrete floor, but the back of the unit remained dim, hidden behind towers of cardboard and the vague shapes of covered furniture. The first thing that hit him wasn't the visual of the mess, but the smell. It rushed out to meet him like an old, unwanted ghost. It was a distinct, dry scent of aging paper, mixed with the sharp tang of dust that had been sitting undisturbed for years. But underneath that, there was something else. It was the faint, lingering smell of leather, maybe from old jackets, and a trace of cedarwood chips he remembered using to protect his things from moths. It was the smell of his past. It smelled like the apartments he used to rent in New York City, like the backstage rooms of theaters, and like the inside of his old car. It was a sensory punch that made his heart beat a little faster. He took a step forward, crossing the threshold. The air inside the small space was cooler than in the hallway, still and stagnant. It felt like stepping into a time capsule that had been sealed hermetically shut. The concrete floor under his boots was dusty, leaving faint footprints as he walked. He moved slowly, navigating the narrow aisle that had been left between the stacks of boxes. On either side, the cardboard walls rose high, almost to the ceiling. Some of the boxes were labeled with thick black marker, the writing hurried and messy. Others were plain, the writing faded away until it was nothing more than a memory of ink. He reached out and ran his hand along the side of a stack of boxes. The cardboard felt soft and fuzzy under his fingertips, degraded slightly by the fluctuations of temperature over the years. It was strange to think that these simple containers held the physical evidence of his life. Everything he hadn't been able to carry with him, everything he hadn't needed in the frantic rush of his career, was right here. It was a graveyard of objects. He stopped in front of a box that was labeled with a year he remembered well. It was perched precariously on top of another, slightly crushed by the weight of time. He gripped the edges of the box and lifted it down. It was lighter than he expected. He set it on the floor and crouched down, his knees popping slightly in the quiet room. He pulled back the flaps of the cardboard. Inside, resting on top of a pile of crumpled newspapers, was a leather jacket. It wasn't a costume from a movie. It was his own jacket, bought from a thrift store on a rainy afternoon. He stopped himself, correcting the thought. It was just an afternoon he spent wandering the city. He pulled the jacket out. The leather was stiff, creased in the elbows and across the chest. It held its shape as if he were still wearing it. He held it up to his face and inhaled. The intensity was intense. It brought back a flash of a specific memory, loud music, the vibration of a motorcycle engine between his legs, and the feeling of the wind rushing past his ears. It was a time when he felt invincible, before the world had taught him how fragile things are. He folded the jacket gently over his arm and looked back into the box. Beneath it were books. Dozens of paperbacks, their spines cracked and their pages yellowing. He picked one up. It was a beat-up copy of a classic novel he had read over and over again. He opened it to the title page. There, in blue ink, was his own signature, followed by a date and a location, Chicago, 1995. He flipped through the pages. Sentences were underlined in pencil. Margins were filled with notes he had scrawled to himself, thoughts about the characters and the story. Seeing his own handwriting from 20 years ago was jarring. The letters looked sharper, more aggressive, as if the person who wrote them was in a bigger hurry to live life than the man crouching on the floor today.
He placed the book back into the box and let his gaze wander around the small space again. It felt overwhelming. There was so much history compressed into this 10 by 10 square. It wasn't just stuff, it was energy. Every object seemed to hum with the memory of where it had been and who he had been when he held it last. He felt a strange mix of guilt and nostalgia. Guilt for leaving these things trapped in the dark for so long, and nostalgia for the person he used to be. He stood up, brushing the dust from his hands. He moved deeper into the unit, pushing aside a plastic bin filled with tangled electrical cords. In the corner, partially hidden behind a dusty amplifier, was a smaller box. It looked different from the others. It wasn't moving supplies or old clothes. It was personal. Keanu shifted the amplifier aside. It was heavier than it looked, grunting with effort as he moved it across the concrete. He knelt down again and opened the smaller box. This one wasn't filled with random junk. It was filled with photographs. There were no digital prints here, just glossy, developed photos held in place by rubber bands that had long since turned brittle and snapped. He picked up a stack. They were held together by a faded ribbon. He untied it and let the photos fan out in his hands. The first one showed a group of people sitting around a table in a dimly lit restaurant. Everyone was laughing, heads thrown back, drinks raised in the air. He recognized himself in the center, younger, thinner, his hair longer, wearing a ridiculous patterned shirt that was fashionable at the time. But it was the people around him that made his breath catch in his throat. There were friends in the photo who had drifted away, relationships that had faded like the ink on the boxes, and there were faces of people who were no longer alive. He saw a man with a bright smile and a mischievous glint in his eye, a friend who had been taken too soon by an illness. He saw a woman with wild hair and kind eyes, who had been like a mentor to him early in his career. Seeing them frozen in this moment of pure joy was both beautiful and incredibly painful. It was a reminder of how fleeting time is, how a moment of laughter can be captured forever while the person is gone. He stared at the photo for a long time. His thumb brushed over the woman's face. He remembered that night. He remembered the jokes someone had told right before the shutter clicked. He remembered the way the food tasted and the music playing on the restaurant's radio. It was a vivid, technicolor memory that had been locked away in this dark room, gathering dust, just like the people in the photo. Keanu felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't cry, not yet. He just felt a profound sense of silence settle over him. The world outside this metal box felt miles away. The Hollywood lights, the red carpets, the noise of his current life, it all disappeared. Here, in the shadows, he was just a human being looking at evidence of a life that had already been lived. He placed the photo carefully on top of the amp, separating it from the pile. He couldn't put it back in the box. It felt wrong to hide that smile away in the dark again. He looked around the rest of the unit. There were still more boxes to open. There were motorcycle helmets covered in grime, old script revisions stacked high, and furniture draped in white sheets that looked like ghosts in the dim light. He knew that the deeper he went, the harder it would get. This was just the surface layer. This was just the easy stuff, jackets and old books. He took a moment to just stand there in the middle of the clutter. He listened to the silence. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, waiting silence. The storage locker wasn't just holding his old things. It was holding pieces of his heart. And he had just begun to pick them up one by one to see if they still fit. He wiped a smudge of dirt from his cheek and looked toward the back of the unit, where a large, taped-up trunk sat waiting. He had a feeling that was where the real story was hiding. But for now, he just breathed, letting the smell of the past fill his lungs, preparing himself for what came next. Keanu carefully placed the stack of loose photographs on top of the amplifier, treating them like fragile glass. He needed a moment to breathe before he dug any deeper. The silence in the storage unit felt heavier now, as if the air itself had absorbed the emotions radiating off the old pictures. He rubbed his hands over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his cheeks, and turned his attention to a large, sturdy box sitting against the wall. It was different from the others. The tape was still mostly intact, and the writing on the side was blocky and precise. He sliced through the tape with his key and folded back the flaps. Inside, stacked in neat columns, were dozens of bound scripts. This was the work box. He pulled one out. The cover was white with black type, a familiar title from the late 90s. He flipped it open. The paper was smooth and heavy, but the edges had yellowed slightly. Seeing the text brought back a flood of memories that had nothing to do with the story on the page. He remembered the long nights in hotel rooms, highlighting his lines with a yellow marker. He remembered the smell of coffee and the anxiety of wondering if he was good enough to say these words out loud. He ran his finger down a page of dialogue. In the margins, his own handwriting stared back at him. Notes scribbled in a hurry. Move left here. Whisper this. Why is he angry? He could almost hear the director's voice in his head, giving notes, and the sound of the crew setting up lights while he sat in a corner trying to memorize. It was strange to see the physical evidence of his job. Most people there knew the complete movie, but here was the raw material, the words that became actions.
Saw the finished movie on a screen, but this was the labor. This was the struggle. He realized how much of his life he had spent inside these pages, living other people's lives while his own was ticking away in the background. He put the script back and lifted another one. This was from a movie he had turned down. He remembered reading it on a plane, feeling a disconnect from the character, and politely declining. Holding it now, he wondered how his life might have been different if he had said yes. Probably not much different, he decided. The work was the work. But seeing the discarded script reminded him of the thousands of tiny choices that had led him to this quiet moment in a storage locker. Underneath the scripts, the items became more personal, a chaotic mix of his professional life and his real life. There was a press kit from a film premiere, glossy photos of him with a smile that looked a little too practiced. There was a laminated pass to a party he didn't remember attending, and then his hand brushed against something soft. He pushed the papers aside and pulled out a leather jacket. It was different from the one he had found earlier. This one was heavier, made of thick black cowhide with zippers on the cuffs and a padded collar. It was the jacket he wore during a specific era of his life when he was constantly on motorcycles, riding through the winding canyons of the city to clear his head. He held it up by the shoulders. It was surprisingly heavy. The leather was cold to the touch. He slipped one arm into the sleeve, then the other. It was tight. He was a bit broader in the shoulders now than he was back then, or maybe the leather had just stiffened over time. He zipped it up halfway. It felt like wearing a suit of armor. He closed his eyes, and for a second, he wasn't in a dusty storage unit. He was on the highway, the wind roaring in his ears, the engine vibrating against his chest, the world blurring into streaks of light. It was a feeling of absolute freedom, a feeling he chased desperately in those days because he was running from things he didn't want to face. He unzipped the jacket and took it off, folding it neatly. He wasn't that man anymore. He didn't need to run. He placed the jacket on top of the scripts. It felt good to acknowledge that part of his past, to honor the joy he found in speed and solitude, but also to recognize that he didn't need to wear it anymore. He reached back into the box, his fingers searching for the bottom. His hand touched something hard and flat, wrapped in a soft towel. He pulled it out. It was heavy, wrapped in a faded beach towel that had seen better days. He undid the corners of the towel and let it fall away. It was a framed photograph. The glass was spotless, protected by the towel. The frame was simple silver metal. Inside the frame was a color picture that seemed to vibrate with life. It was a group shot, taken in someone's backyard. There was a grill smoking in the background and strings of lights hanging from the trees. In the center of the frame was a younger version of Keanu, laughing so hard his head was thrown back. Around him were friends, some actors, some musicians, some just regular people he had known in the city. He held the frame with both hands, his eyes moving from face to face. There was a guy playing a guitar in the corner, his eyes closed in concentration. Keanu remembered him. He was the one who introduced him to blues music. He had passed away years ago. There was a woman with bright red hair and a contagious smile, holding a glass of wine. She had been one of the first people to encourage him to take acting seriously. She had moved back to her home country, and they had lost touch. But looking at the photo, it wasn't the loss that struck him first. It was the energy. The photo captured a specific moment of pure, unburdened happiness. No one in the picture was worried about the future. No one knew that some of them would get sick, that some would drift apart, that life would get so complicated. They were just there, in the backyard, eating burgers and listening to music. It was a slice of time that had been perfectly preserved, while the real world had crumbled away around it. Keanu sat down on a plastic crate, the frame resting on his lap. He felt a deep ache in his chest, a mixture of love and sadness. It was painful to see how young they all were, how much life they still had ahead of them in that snapshot. It was a reminder of how quickly time moves. He traced the line of the silver frame with his thumb. He thought about the man in the photo. That guy had no idea what was coming. He thought he had forever. He thought his friends would always be around, that the backyard parties would never end. Looking at it now, from the vantage point of 20 years later, the photo felt like a message from a lost world. It was beautiful, but it hurt to look at. He didn't want to put it back in the box. He couldn't bury these faces again in the dark. He stood up and placed the framed photograph carefully next to the stack of loose prints on the amplifier. It felt like he was rescuing them, pulling them out of the void and giving them a place in the light again. He looked back into the nearly empty box. There was nothing left but some old magazines and a few receipts. He had sifted through the surface layer of his past. He had seen the work, the clothes, and the friends, but he knew there was more. The locker was deep, and he had only cleared the front section. Toward the very back of the unit, behind a stack of unread books and an old motorcycle helmet, he could see a battered shoebox. It looked insignificant compared to the piles of clothes and furniture. It was shoved into the corner, almost hidden by a dented metal shelf. But something about it caught his eye. The tape on the box was yellowed with age, and it looked like it had been handled with extreme care before being stored away.
Keanu felt a shift in the atmosphere. The curiosity he had felt earlier was turning into a sense of dread. He knew, without opening it, that this box was different. This wasn't about movie rolls or old jackets. This was the heavy stuff. This was the part of his heart he had locked away because he didn't know how to carry it with him every day. He wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to clean off the dust. He took a slow breath. The air in the unit felt thinner now. He stepped over the pile of scripts and moved toward the back of the locker, his eyes fixed on the battered shoebox. It was time to open the last door. Keanu stepped over the pile of scripts and moved toward the dark back corner of the unit. The air felt thicker here, further away from the light of the hallway. He had to duck slightly to avoid a hanging shelf that had been installed carelessly years ago. He reached out and gently pushed aside an old motorcycle helmet. It was white, scratched, and covered in a gray film of dust. As he moved it, a cloud of fine particles danced in the beam of light that managed to reach this far back. Behind the helmet, shoved into the tightest corner, sat the shoebox. It looked incredibly out of place among the sturdy plastic bins and metal equipment. It was just cardboard, soft and frayed at the edges. The brand name on the side had worn away completely, leaving just a faint, ghostly imprint of letters. It didn't look like it held anything valuable. To anyone else, it would look like trash, something to be thrown away without a second thought. But to Keanu, it looked like the most dangerous thing in the room. He crouched down, his knees cracking in the quiet space, and wrapped his hands around the box. It was light, but it felt heavy in his heart. He could see that the tape holding the lid shut was yellowed and brittle, applied in haste a long time ago. There were multiple layers of it, as if the person who sealed it had been determined to make sure nothing ever escaped. He lifted the box and moved back to the cleared area where he had been sitting. He placed it gently on top of a plastic crate, treating it with the same care he would use to hold a newborn baby. He sat down on the concrete floor, crossing his legs. He needed to be low to the ground for this. He needed to be stable. For a long time, he just looked at the box. He didn't open it. He traced the edges of the cardboard with his thumb. He knew exactly what was inside. He remembered the day he packed it. It had been a rainy afternoon, not outside, but inside his soul. It was during a time when the pain of loss was too sharp to carry around in his daily life, so he decided to pack it away. He had convinced himself that if he put these things in a box, the sadness would stay there too. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of old paper and memories. He hooked his finger under a loose corner of the tape and pulled. It made a dry, tearing sound like dead leaves crunching underfoot. He peeled the tape back slowly, trying not to rip the cardboard. When the last strip gave way, he lifted the lid. There was no smell of leather or old clothes. There was only the faint, sweet scent of dried potpourri and lavender, a smell that instantly transported him back to a hospital room and a small apartment filled with flowers. Inside the box, it wasn't a jumbled mess. Everything was arranged with care, separated by sheets of white tissue paper that had now turned translucent with age. Keanu lifted the first layer of tissue paper. Beneath it lay a stack of greeting cards and envelopes bound together with a faded pink ribbon. He undid the ribbon and let it fall to his lap. He picked up the top card. It was handmade. The front was covered in glitter and glued-on pasta shells, a child's craft that had been treasured for decades. He opened it. Inside, in handwriting that he would recognize anywhere, were the words, "Thinking of you, Big Brother." His throat tightened. He picked up the next one, and the next.
They were all from his sister, Kim. Some were simple get-well cards from when she was first diagnosed. Others were long letters written on notebook paper during her treatments. He scanned a few lines. She wrote about the doctors, the medicine, the food, but mostly she wrote about him. She asked if he was eating enough. She told him she was proud of the movies he was making. She teased him about his hair. He held the letters against his chest, closing his eyes. Seeing her handwriting was like hearing her voice again. It was a sound he missed more than anything else in the world. It was a voice that had been silenced too soon, taken by a cruel disease that didn't care about kindness or love. He felt a familiar wave of grief wash over him, but it wasn't as sharp as it used to be. It was softer now, like a bruise that aches when you touch it, but doesn't bleed anymore. He set the letters aside gently and reached back into the box. Underneath the stack of paper was something small and lumpy. He pulled it out. It was a small pouch, hand-sewn from scraps of purple velvet and shiny blue fabric. The stitching was uneven and clumsy, done by hands that shook from sickness, but it was made with love. Keanu turned the pouch over in his hands. He remembered the day she gave it to him. She was sitting in her wheelchair, wrapped in a blanket, smiling triumphantly as she handed it to him. She had made it for his lucky rocks. He had always had a habit of picking up interesting stones on his hikes or walks, carrying them in his pockets until they wore holes in his jeans. She had made this pouch so he could keep them safe.
He loosened the drawstring and poured the contents into his palm. 3 smooth, gray, tumbled stones fell out. He rubbed his thumb over the surface of the top one. It was cool and smooth. He remembered exactly where he had found it, a riverbed in Oregon while they were on a road trip together years before she got sick. They had sat on the bank all afternoon, skipping stones and talking about nothing, enjoying the peace of the water. Holding the pouch, Keanu realized that by locking this box away, he hadn't just stored away objects, he had tried to lock away the pain of missing her. He thought if he didn't see her handwriting, he wouldn't miss her laugh. If he didn't see the rocks, he wouldn't remember the river. But he was wrong. The love was still there, burning just as brightly, hidden under layers of dust and time. He carefully put the rocks back into the pouch and pulled the string tight. He held it in his fist, pressing it hard against his palm, as if trying to transfer the warmth of his hand into the cold fabric. He felt a sense of peace settle over him. It was a relief to finally have these things near him again. It was a relief to stop running from the memory of her. He looked back into the box. It wasn't empty yet. There was one more thing at the very bottom, resting alone on the cardboard. It was a single, folded piece of white notebook paper. It didn't have a name on it, but he knew what it was. He had written it himself during a time of hope that had later turned into heartbreak. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the paper. He had a feeling that this final piece of paper was the reason he had come here today. It was the last message from the past, waiting for him to be ready to read it. Keanu stared at the folded piece of notebook paper lying in the bottom of the shoebox. It looked so ordinary, just a crumpled square of white paper with blue lines. But he knew that this single sheet held the weight of the world. He reached in, his fingers trembling slightly for the first time that day, and pinched the corner of the paper between his thumb and forefinger. He lifted it out slowly, as if removing a fragile artifact from a dig site. The paper made a soft, dry sound as he unfolded it. It had been folded so many times that the creases were ready to tear. He smoothed it out against his knee, holding it carefully so it wouldn't rip. The handwriting was his own, but it looked different. It was neat, precise, and filled with a sense of purpose that he remembered vividly. At the top of the page, he had written a date. It was from a time of intense hope, a time when the future seemed like a bright, open road waiting to be traveled. Under the date, he had written a simple title, The List. Keanu took a deep breath and lowered his eyes to the first line. It read, "Teach her to ride a bike." His eyes moved to the next line, "Take her to the ocean and show her the waves." Further down, read her Shakespeare until she falls asleep. Build a treehouse. Make pancakes on Sunday mornings. Tell her she is loved every single day. He read the list once, and then he started over from the top. Each line was a bullet point of a life he had dreamed of, a future that he had planned with every fiber of his being. These weren't just tasks, they were sacred promises he had made to himself in the quiet of the night. They represented the deep, overwhelming love of a father, a love that was so big it felt like it would burst out of his chest. But as his eyes traveled down the page, the silence in the storage unit became absolute. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy. It was filled with the ghosts of all the moments that never happened. He saw the bike that was never bought, the waves that were never watched together, the pancakes that were never cooked. The list was a map to a destination that life had cruelly blocked off. He didn't weep. There were no tears running down his face. His body was too still for that. He just sat there, holding the paper, feeling a profound sense of loss that went beyond words. It was the kind of silence that happens when something inside you breaks so deeply that sound just can't express it. He looked at the handwriting, recognizing the optimism in the loops of the letters. That man who wrote this list didn't know what was coming. He thought he had all the time in the world. Keanu shifted his weight on the plastic crate. The crate creaked, but the sound seemed distant. He thought about how life moves in ways we can't control. We make plans, we write lists, we build dreams in our heads like castles made of sand. And then the tide comes in. It doesn't mean the castle wasn't beautiful. It doesn't mean the love wasn't real. It just means the ocean is stronger than the sand. He looked at the last item on the list. It was simpler than the others. It just said, "Just be there." That one hit the hardest. He wanted to be there. He wanted to be the protector, the guide, the steady hand. Reading it now, years later, he realized that in a way, he still was. He was here in this dusty storage unit, sitting on a crate, honoring that love. He was still the father who loved his child, even though he couldn't be there in the way he had planned. The love didn't die just because the life did. It was still here, trapped in this box, waiting for him to find it again.
He sat like that for a long time. He didn't check his watch. He didn't look at his phone. The world outside those metal walls ceased to exist. There was only him, the quiet hum of the lights, and the piece of paper in his hands. He let the silence wash over him. He let himself feel the pain, acknowledging it instead of running from it. It was a moment of communion with his past self, a way of telling that younger man that it was okay, that even though the list was never finished, the love was real. Finally, after what felt like hours, Keanu moved. He didn't crumple the paper up. He didn't throw it away. He carefully refolded it along the old creases, making sure the edges lined up perfectly. He held the small square of paper in his palm for a moment, feeling its texture. He realized he couldn't leave it here in the dark anymore. It didn't belong in a box. It belonged with him. He stood up slowly, his legs stiff from sitting. He reached into the pocket of his jeans and pulled out his wallet. He opened it and slipped the folded list behind his ID card, right against his heart. It was a small gesture, but it felt massive. He was taking the memory out of storage. He was choosing to carry it with him, not as a burden, but as a part of who he was. He looked around the unit one last time. The space looked different now. It wasn't a graveyard of ghosts anymore. It was just a room full of old things. The heavy energy had lifted. He had faced the hardest part, and he was still standing. He felt a strange sense of lightness, as if by opening the box, he had let some air into a room that had been sealed for too long. He began to tidy up. He placed the letters from his sister back into the shoebox, but he didn't tape it shut this time. He folded the lid over loosely. He put the pouch with the Lucky Rocks in his jacket pocket, next to his keys. He wanted to keep them close.
He picked up the framed photograph of his friends and the leather jacket. These were the things he was taking with him. The rest, the scripts, the old clothes, the random clutter, could stay for now. Or maybe he would come back and deal with it later. But he knew he didn't have to be afraid of it anymore. He walked toward the open doorway of the unit. The hallway outside looked brighter than he remembered. He stepped out of the shadows and into the light. He reached up and grabbed the handle of the rolling metal door. He pulled it down gently. The door made a loud clatter as it rolled closed, sealing the unit back up. But it didn't feel like a jail cell closing. It felt like closing a book after reading the final chapter. He took the heavy brass padlock from his pocket. He looked at it for a second, then snapped it shut on the hasp. The click was final. Keanu turned and walked down the long corridor. His footsteps echoed, but they sounded lighter now. He walked past the other units, past the numbers 402, 400, 398. He didn't look at them. He was focused on the exit sign glowing red at the end of the hall. He pushed through the heavy glass exit door and stepped out into the afternoon. The air was warm and fresh, smelling of asphalt and dry grass. He walked to his car, a simple, practical vehicle parked in the shade. He unlocked the door and got in, sitting behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. He patted his chest, right over his wallet, feeling the faint outline of the folded list. He patted his jacket pocket, feeling the bulk of the velvet pouch. He wasn't leaving empty-handed. He was leaving with the pieces of his heart that he had left behind. Keanu started the engine. The car hummed to life. He put it in gear and drove out of the lot, merging onto the busy street. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't need music to fill the silence. He just drove, moving forward into the future, carrying the past with him gently, finally at peace.